Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 98, The Dorwards. Captain George Dorward was born in Geldry, Fife, Scotland in July 1832. He began his seafaring career at 9 years old, which he continued until he was 24. He married Anne Haxton in December 1852 in Fife, Scotland. Their first two children were born in Scotland, and then he received his competency certificate as a second mate in July 1855 and went on the sailing ship the Beamer to Melbourne in January 1856. He deserted ship and took up the invitation given by Captain Cadell in July 1854 to join him navigating the River Murray. Anne Dorward sailed out on the Adriatic from Dundee, Scotland on the 10th of October 1857 with their two children aged 4 and 18 months. Also on board was Anne's sister Helen Haxton. Another sister, Margaret Haxton, arrived in Australia in November 1859 but died of tuberculosis in 1860, aged only 32. By July 1858, the family were based in Echuca in Victoria, with George operating the Grappler, a snagging boat, as a part owner at the time. In 1859, George was running a store at Lang's Crossing, now known as Hay, in southern New South Wales, for Captain Randall, Captain Cadell's chief rival. By 1861, George was in partnership owning the Caledonian Hotel in Hay. Only 172 people lived in the town at this time. He then became the publican and storekeeper at Willanthry, 70 miles north of Booligal in New South Wales, in partnership with his brother-in-law James Mann. They dissolved the partnership in November 1864 and George sold it in March 1865. He sold it for 80 gold sovereigns and went with a black tracker to Wagga to bank it. Dan Morgan, the bushranger, arrived in the area the next day. It was assumed he'd heard about the sale, but was too late. More information on the exploits of Daniel Morgan are in episode 37. In 1864, Anne and the children were living in Deniliquin in southern New South Wales, and George had purchased land at Moama, where he was still captaining steamers such as the Riverine and the Beechworth. James Mann also established a stock and station business in Deniliquin at this time. In 1866, it was recorded that George was the captain of the Beechworth and was about to open a brewery in Deniliquin in partnership with George Elliott. They built the 3-storey building that contained a cellar. George sold his share in the brewery in March 1866 to become part owner of the paddle steamer Victoria. In 1868, they added a barge they called the Pocahontas. In August 1869, both boats were sold for £3,000. George then purchased the Junction Inn at Moama in 1870. It was known as Maiden's Inn at the time, and Maiden's Folly by the locals, as it had 22 rooms, 14 of those bedrooms, 2 cellars, a cedar staircase, and a ballroom complete with a chandelier. George sold it in May 1872. He then entered into partnership with Captain Davies, owning and operating a number of steamers. In 1883, George formed a partnership for a lease of land at Mount Wood in far northwest New South Wales that totalled 415,000 acres. In 1904, George leased and lived at Whittabranna Station, that consisted of 50,300 acres next to Mount Wood. Anne Dorward seemed to have stayed at their property St Fort with her sister at Moama at this time. And on the 16th of July 1887, there was an article in the Australian Town and Country Journal about Captain Dorward. It says, "A Murray River pioneer, Captain Dorward of Moama. Among the old residents of the pleasantly situated border township of Moama is Captain Dorward. He is a native of Scotland. At the early age of 9, he began his seafaring career, which he continued for 15 years. He arrived in Melbourne on the Beamer from Liverpool, and of which vessel he was second mate. The Beamer was fitted up in Dundee under his supervision, and he came out to the colonies several times before he made up his mind to remain here. It was in 1855 that Captain Cadell, who was well acquainted with him and thus had a good knowledge of his energetic and self-reliant character, made him an offer of an engagement for the purpose of opening up the navigation of the River Murray. The appointment was a good one. He was allowed £1 per day and all expenses. Captain Dorward's first trip to the then almost unknown waters of the Murray was made in the same year. He went from Melbourne, proceeding overland to Albury. Captains Cadell and Dorward went on their first journey down the river from Albury in a boat made by themselves out of the hoops of old brandy casks and covered it over with canvas. In this they started, proceeding down as far as the junction of the Edward, where Captain Cadell left, going overland to Goolwa in South Australia and leaving Captain Dorward to proceed with charting the river downward until his return, which he effected the steamer Albury. This was an iron boat built in the old land and brought out in sections, together with the sister boat, the Gundagai, which did not, however, start running until a year or so afterward. The Albury was in charge of Captain Johnston, who, upon meeting Captain Dorward, gave up command to the latter, and the vessel was at length successfully taken up to Albury, it being the first one ever made, with the passage from South Australia to that town. And I covered George Johnston in a lot more detail in episode 92. The boat, together with the consort named the Eureka, was in tow and took up a cargo of goods intended for the Ovens diggings, which were then in the height of prosperity. The Eureka and its freight were left at Albury, which at this time was very small. But after the breaking out of the Ovens gold rush, some 35 miles away, it increased rapidly by reason of it being situated on the direct highway from Sydney. There was then very little wool grown in this part of the colony, the upper Murray being stocked with cattle. There was no other town lower down the river. Howlong was not in existence at this time. There was a punt at Corowa. There was also one at Mulwala, in addition to a public house. The next crossing places were at Maiden's Punt at Moama and Hopwood's Ferry, a little farther down the river. These two latter were the main crossing places for cattle coming from the back blocks to Melbourne. After 1856, Captain Dorward made regular trips down the Murray with cargo, the journey of 2,000 miles from Goolwa to Albury occupying 3 to 4 weeks. In 1857, the Murray Steam Navigation Company established a depot at Waganya, Captain Cadell having formed a company to take over his boats. The stores were built by Mr. John Ford. They were placed there so the boats would reach that point when the river would not allow them to go as far as Albury, and at the same time the road to Ovens was very different as regarded distance. The blacks were very numerous. The subject of our sketch says that he has seen as many as 500 of them engaged in a corroboree at night time on the flats near the banks of the river. The hardy pioneers were compelled to carry revolvers, facetiously termed pepper boxes, slung on their belts for the purpose of protecting themselves. What a change a quarter of a century makes. This year there was not a single black forthcoming to claim his blanket on the Queen's birthday at the Moama Courthouse. As the steamers were able to run for only 6 months of the year, Captain Dorward employed his time during the summer months with snagging parties. Captain Cadell having secured a grant of £2,000 from the New South Wales government for the purpose of clearing the river. The company broke up in 1860, the trade having fallen off owing to the improved communications by road with the metropolis. Captain Dorward left the river and went out back for some time, taking contracts for fencing and going into storekeeping and hotel keeping. He returned to Moama in 1864 and bought the land on which he now resides in his comfortable homestead. He has since purchased additional land, now owning 5,000 acres stocked with sheep and 300 acres devoted to the cultivation of wheat. During this interval, wool was produced in large quantities. The river trade consequently revived considerably. Captain Dorward, with his usual enterprise, bought a stern-wheel paddle steamer, the Victoria, and for 2 years ran it up and down, finally selling out to the Wagga Wagga Company. He is at present time largely interested in squatting pursuits in the Western District. He can remember the period when all the wool produced on the Murray would have barely sufficed to have filled his small steamer, and he has known several instances where he and his partner, Captain Davies, have carried as many as 20,000 bales in one season. At Echuca they had a shipbuilding yard where they constructed all their own vessels for use on the river, and also several for other people. They did an extensive carrying trade from the Darling and Murrumbidgee, he having been through Wilcannia when the site of that now flourishing township was a mere sheepyard. At the last elections he was announced as a likely candidate, but unfortunately, owing to sickness, he was prevented from coming forward. From his large and varied experience of the colony, this clear-headed and practical colonist would have proved a most valuable member for the country in general. And in the Argus on the 10th of March 1906, it's announced that Captain Dorward passed away at Toorak, late of Moama. The death of Captain Dorward, part owner of Mount Wood Station near Tibooburra, is recorded. Captain Dorward was one of the very earliest pioneers on the river, having assisted Captain Cadell to navigate the Murray on the Lady Darling in the early 50s. The Lady Darling was the first steamer to arrive at Echuca, and in those days it was no mean feat to perform. From that time onward, he and the late Captain Davies of Murtee Station became largely interested in the shipping trade of the Murray and Darling, having steamers of their own running for many years. Some 20 years ago, Captain Dorward entered into pastoral pursuits and became well known in Tibooburra and Mount Brown districts. Of late, he's taken no active part in management. He died in Melbourne, but his remains were interred at the Navarino Estate, a property owned near Moama, where he lived for several years. Captain Dorward had a bluff, honest way with him and was well liked by those that knew him. And another article outlining his death. The death, which was announced last night of Captain George Dorward Sr., though not altogether unexpected by his friends, will cause considerable and widespread regret in this town and district. The deceased gentleman, who had been ailing for some time, was one of the earliest, most enterprising of the Murray pioneers. The late Mr. Dorward was of the bluff old British stamp, always had the courage of his own opinions and expressed them, and as is usual with men of this class, enjoyed widespread esteem from all sections of the community. Many years ago, with Moore and Palmer, he acquired the Mount Wood station property in northwestern New South Wales. For some time, owing to the serious droughts of the period, considerable management was necessary to keep the large number of stock alive. He was also interested in Moama Township property and for some years resided there. And there's quite an impressive gravestone at Moama Cemetery with the Dorward family. George and Anne Dorward's children. George Roy Dorward was the firstborn. He was known to the family as Geordie and was born in Scotland in September 1853. He married Emma Smith at Warparilla near Echuca in January 1877. They had 7 children born in Moama and Echuca. On the 12th of December 1901, it mentions how George was a master mariner from Moama, and he was a captain of paddle steamers for more than 40 years, returning for each season, even when living in Melbourne. It seemed that there was some discord in the family, as in May 1902, George revokes an original bequest to George Jr., and George moves his family to Melbourne very soon after. In 1907, it mentions that George Dorward, Master Mariner, is residing at Allumdale, just out of Deniliquin. And George's Aunt Susan, that is Anne's sister, lived with them after 1910, and then she returned to Scotland. In 1924, George was living in Carlton and stated his occupation as a mariner, and he died in Sunbury, Victoria, on the 6th of September 1942, aged 88. 2 daughters, Jane and Margaret, did not survive childhood. The next child was James Mann Dorward, and he was born at Booligal on the 11th of October 1862. He was named after his uncle James Mann, a superintendent of stations at Wanganella and Booligal, who'd married Helen Haxton, Anne's sister, in December 1861. James Dorward farmed at Moira in 1885, and he married Sarah Elsie Osborne in Campaspe, Victoria in 1887 at her parents' home. Sarah was born in Ireland in 1835 and came to Melbourne with her parents in 1855. Her father lived at Bendigo and then in Tulleen in Victoria. James and Sarah had 3 children, George Osborne in 1887, Anne Haxton Dorward in 1888 and Elizabeth May Hamilton Dorward in 1889, all born in Echuca or Moama. James initially ran his father's farm, Navarino, just out of Moama, although family stories say that due to disagreements within the family, James decided to select land at Colomo, just out of Deniliquin, and he called it Allumdale. This was in an area that was known as the Island. It had the Edward River on one side and Collagen Creek on the other. And a land record states that James Mann Dorward of Deniliquin, 23rd of March 1894, had an area of 640 acres at Colomo. By 1930, he's mentioned as the owner of Allumdale with 2,500 acres. John ran the little paddle steamer the Nile between his property at Colomo, Allumdale and Deniliquin, and on the 4th of September 1909, it mentions in an article, River Steamer. Mr. J. M. Dorward has secured the Murray River Steamer Nile for the purpose of carrying wool while the rivers are high. The steamer was to leave Echuca yesterday, and it's Mr. Dorward's intention to come down the Edward, then go up Bullatail Creek and ascertain if it's possible to carry the Cornella wool by boat to Deniliquin. A month later, Correspondence from J.M. Dorward says, having recently purchased the steamer Nile and now conducting a wood business in Deniliquin, I hereby make application to rent half an acre of land frontage to Edward River, known as the Watertown Reserve, adjoining D. Hayes's residence for a wood depot at the rental of £2 per annum. The Nile sank at Morago, a farming township just across from his property, but it was salvaged and sold in 1905. In 1906, Dorward was using a steamer called the Mayho to bring timber from his property to Deniliquin, and on the 17th of July 1906 it mentions, the river steamer Mayho arrived at the port of Deniliquin on Wednesday afternoon, this being the first vessel to put in an appearance locally for several years. Mr. J.M. Dorward of Allendale, Colomo, intends to use the steamer while the river is navigable for bringing wood and sawn timber to Deniliquin. John was known as a true gentleman, a bit of a dreamer with a social conscience. In 1917, John's recorded as farming at Phillip Island in Victoria on a property he called Rill. On the 15th of April 1921, it says James Mann Dorward, grazier of Allendale, stated that he leased his property to the defendant from the 1st of September 1915 for 3 years, with an option of a 2-year extension, of which Mr. Hunter took advantage. The property contained an orchard of 2 acres, planted in 1909. When the defendant took possession, there were 89 trees, and the orchard was in good order. Some of the trees were bearing at the time. He next saw the orchard early in 1916, when it was in a very fair state, but nothing to complain about. The next time he saw the orchard was in October 1918. The majority of the trees were in a broken condition, and it appears the witness had cattle or horses that had been in the orchard. He next saw the orchard in August 1919. There were only then 6 trees that could have produced fruit. And then he saw the orchard again in August 1920 when he took over his property. So he put in a civil claim to Mr. Hunter for the mismanagement of his property. James and Elsie sailed to England in May 1828, and they stayed until November of that year, as James and Elsie's daughter Anne and her husband William Mason were living in Ireland. And James died in Deniliquin in February 1935 at the age of 72. And the Deniliquin Pastoral Times outlined the death of J.M. Dorward. Mr. James Mann Dorward, grazier, a resident of the Deniliquin district for over 40 years, died at the Deniliquin Hospital after a short illness. On recent visits to Deniliquin, Mr. Dorward appeared to be in good health and informed his friends that though nearly 73, he was feeling particularly well. The announcement of his death was therefore quite unexpected. The deceased gentleman was the son of late Captain George and Mrs. Dorward of Mountwood Station to Tibooburra and St Fort Moama, and was a nephew of the late James and Mrs. Mann of Deniliquin. He was born at Bullygall in 1862 and baptised in Deniliquin by the late Dr. Mercer. In his boyhood days, Mr. Dorward lived at Moama and was educated at the Echuca Grammar School. He married Miss Elsie Osborne, second daughter of the late Henry Osborne, a well-known member of the Bendigo Stock Exchange. He selected land on Clymo Station west of Deniliquin in 1894 and named the property Allendale, where he subsequently lived with his family. For a long period, he spent a great deal of time on Phillip Island, where he acquired land, and in recent years he only occasionally visited his Deniliquin district property. He did not take a prominent part in public affairs, but was held in high esteem by a wide circle of friends who appreciated his qualities as a good, living, straightforward gentleman. The deceased is survived by his widow, one son, George Osborne Dorward, and 2 daughters, Mrs. W. Mason of Castru's, Londonderry, Ireland, and Mrs. F. C. Druitt of Deniliquin. And on the 14th of November 1944, it announces the death of Elsie Dorward, aged 84, and she passed away at Many Waters, Warbricken, at the home of her daughter, Mrs. F. C. Druitt. Mrs. Dorward was a native of Bendigo and lived at Barnadown prior to her marriage to the late Mr. James Dorward. She then lived for 8 years at St Fort Moama, and in 1894 her husband selected Allendale. There she lived continuously, except for a few years that she spent with her husband on Phillip Island, where they had a grazing property. When Mr. and Mrs. Dorward acquired Allendale, there were only a few bush tracks to their new home, and there were no bridges over the streams in the locality to enable them to cross to and fro. However, with the spirit of pioneers, they set to work to effect improvements and lived to see the much-needed bridges constructed after years of persistent agitation. Both took great interest in the development and progress of the district, and they were associated with every movement for its advancement. Her death will be regretted by many old residents who in the past enjoyed her friendship and hospitality at Allumdale. The deceased is survived by one son, Mr. George Dorward of Allumdale, and one daughter, Mrs. F.C. Druitt of Many Waters, Deniliquin. So their children, George Osborne Dorward, was born in Echuca in 1888, and he bought land at Ryle, Phillip Island in 1914. George enlisted in World War I in June 1917. He left Australia in February 1918 and fought in France as a gunner in the 36th Heavy Artillery Unit. He was discharged in May 1919, and on his return he continued to farm the property Ryle on Phillip Island and also ran Allumdale. On the 24th of June 1938, the engagement was announced of Janet Mary MacDonald, MA, Principal of Clarendon Presbyterian Ladies College, Ballarat, to George Osborne Dorward of Allumdale, Deniliquin. And he married Janet in 1938 when he was 50 and Janet 36. Janet was Scottish and had emigrated in 1933. She lived at Geelong North in 1949, where George was a grazier still farming at Allumdale. He was a developer in Newcombe, near Geelong, and actually built a small shopping centre there. And Janet died in 1953 in Geelong, George dying in 1969, also in Geelong at the age of 81. And on the 18th of January 1949, it says Mr. and Mrs. George Dorward and their son Ian will settle temporarily in the Geelong district after leaving Deniliquin. It is understood Mr. Dorward has disposed of his property, Allumdale, which has been in the possession of the Dorward family since 1894. And just as an aside, my great-great-grandfather, John Patrick Higgins, actually purchased this property and it remained in the Higgins family until the 1980s. His father, the late Mr. James Mann Dorward, selected the property in that year and his son took over in 1935. George Dorward has taken a most active interest in public affairs and is at present a member of the Victorian New South Wales Executive of the Australian Primary Producers Union, in which he represents the Riverina. And Mr. Dorward has also been keenly interested in the Deniliquin Pastoral and Agricultural Society. Mrs. Dorward has been closely associated with CWA activities, as well as the P&A Society Ladies Committee, of which she's president. Their second child, Anne Haxton Dorward, was born in New South Wales in July 1889. She moved to Ireland and married William Bowman Mason there in October 1915 when she was 26. And it says, prior to Miss Dorward's departure from Phillip Island for her trip abroad with her grand aunt, Miss Haxton, 20 months ago, Mrs. W.T. McPhee gave a picnic at Forest Coves to her immediate friends and presented her with a travelling cushion of a large kookaburra on linen done by a Western Australian artist. And on the 7th of January 1916, the wedding was announced. A fashionable wedding took place at the Queen's Hotel, Dundee, Scotland, on the 27th of October, between Mr. William Bowman Mason of Castruce, Londonderry, Ireland, son of the late Mr. and Mrs. Mason of Easton House, Glasgow, and Miss Anne H. Dorward, elder daughter of Mr. and Mrs. J. M. Dorward of Allumdale and Tamudgery of Phillip Island. Anne and William had 5 children, and Anne died in Belfast in November 1941 at the age of 52. Their third child, Elizabeth May Hamilton Dorward, was born in Moama in 1891. She married Frederick Clement Druitt at Hunters Hill, New South Wales in 1925. Frederick had fought in the Boer War. They had 3 children. Fred worked as a shearing contractor and they owned a farm called Many Waters near Deniliquin in New South Wales. Elizabeth lived in Deniliquin in 1968 and died in Deniliquin in June 1973 at the age of 82. And there are still descendants living in Deniliquin today. The fourth child of Captain Dorward was Susan Helen Dorward, and she was born on the 12th of June 1865 in Deniliquin. She died at the age of 17 on the 26th of May 1883 in Moama of typhoid fever. And an article outlined her death, saying another death from typhoid fever. This disease has cut short another promising young life in the district, this time the unfortunate victim being the daughter of Mr. G. Dorward of Moama, who succumbed after a short illness. The funeral, which took place yesterday, was one of the largest that's taken place in Echuca or Moama, and much sympathy is expressed for the bereaved relatives of the deceased young lady. Captain Dorward's 5th child was William Haxton Dorward, and he was born on the 22nd of May 1867 in Moama. William was the first manager of the Mountwood property. He married Dina Armstrong in Victoria in August 1898 when he was 31 and Dina 29. And their marriage outlined in the paper, Dorward Armstrong. On the 30th of August at Kangaroo Ground by Reverend Bunteen, cousin of the bride, William Haxton Dorward of Mount Wood Station, New South Wales, the third son of Captain Dorward Moama, to Dina, third surviving daughter of S. Armstrong, Kangaroo Ground. On the 24th of March 1903, there was a notice saying, "Take notice of the partnership existing between William Haxton Dorward of Mount Wood and William Ogilvie Thompson of Mount Stewart, Francis Little of Wittenbrenner in the state of New South Wales, Simon David Armstrong of Carlton, Victoria, Abdul Khalik of Broken Hill in New South Wales, and Saeed Akbar of Broken Hill as camel proprietors and carriers under the style of firm the Dorward Khalik Carrying Company. It has been dissolved by mutual consent on the 9th day of February 1903. The business of the partnership will in future be carried on by William Haxton Dorward, William Ogilvie Thompson, Francis Little and Simon David Armstrong under the style the Mount Wood Camel Company." On the 13th of January 1906, the following appointments are announced in yesterday's issue of the State Government Gazette. Mr. William Haxton Dorward, JP, to be Deputy Licensing Magistrate for the Licensing District of Melparinka and to act as Coroner at Melparinka during the absence of H. Malone, Police Magistrate. William and Dina had 5 children, and William inherited Navarino after his father's death, and William's son, William Jr., then inherited it after William's death. William's other son, John Armstrong Dorward, was appointed manager of Mount Wood in 1929. William Haxton Dorward died in Hampton, Victoria in April 1911. He was aged only 43 and their youngest child was only 1 when he died. And his death notice stated, "William Haxton Dorward of Toonkurry, Orlando Street, Hampton, loved husband of Dina Dorward, late of Mount Wood and Wahita branch stations." On the 28th of June 1911, it says an application has been made by the Perpetual Trustees Association for letters of administration in the will of the estate of William Haxton Dorward, formerly of Tibooburra, New South Wales, but late of Hampton, Victoria, gentleman, who died on the 14th of April. The Victorian estate is sworn at £8,916, being realty of £730 and personal funds £8,186. There's also New South Wales assets valued at £7,691, making a gross total in the 2 states of £16,607. Under the will, the widow is to receive the furniture, plate and trinkets and a legacy of £100 and an annuity of £300. The balance of the estate is to be held in trust for the infant children, of whom there are 5. So he passed away quite a wealthy man. The 6th child was George Johnston Dorward, and he was born on the 27th of March 1871 at Moama, when the family owned and ran the Junction Inn. He married Susan Foley in 1909 at the Manse in Echuca, and they had no children. On the 4th of March 1911, it mentions that there was a clearing sale of sheep, cattle, horses, implements, hay, seed, wheat and furniture on the farm St Fort at Navarino, 7 miles from Moama, on account of Mr. John Dorward, who's leased this property for a term of years. In 1912, after the death of his mother, John inherited Ratillet, which was 5 acres in the township of Moama. He also inherited Rosebank Cottage at Moama and the St Fort property of 1,500 acres. He was president of the Moama Show Society in 1913, and he ran the property St Fort, but he also lived with Susan in Brighton, Victoria. And on the 13th of February 1936, it mentions Mr. John Dorward, manager of Mount Wood Station, which is situated in New South Wales, 50 miles equidistant from the South Australian and Queensland borders, comprising of 600,000 acres, is on a visit with Mrs. Dorward to his brother and sister-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. W.H. Dorward at Navarino. And John died on the 1st of September 1966 at Thornley, New South Wales, at the age of 95. The 7th child, Alfred William Hay Dorward, was born on the 12th of March 1873 at Moama, and he died aged 3 on the 21st of October 1876 at Moama. So out of a family of 8 children, only 3 children out of the 8 have descendants.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.